Hello everyone, welcome to the Europas Awards, and we've been doing a series of panels and interviews about European tech startups and what's been going on over the last year. My name is Mike Butcher, I'm the founder of the Europas Awards and a journalist at Techcrunch. By all independent analysis, Europe's tech ecosystem is taking off like never before. Those of us who've been here for a while know it was pretty good, but it seems to be being noticed by people abroad, especially in the US. But as US VCs decamp to Miami to evade the Bay Area's COVID lockdowns, high taxes and house prices, perhaps they should be decamping to London, Stockholm or Bucharest. So we've got two fantastic investors to talk to about this subject. Firstly, Aydin Senkut is the founder and managing direct partner of Felicis Ventures, an original super angel turned multi-stage investor. He's been named on the Forbes Midas list for the past 7 years, as well as the New York Times top 20 venture capitalist list for the past 4 years. His recent focus areas include consumerization of enterprise, security, AI, mental health, and longevity. And he's well known as an early backer of a number of iconic companies, including Shopify, Fitbit, Rovio, Aydin, Credit Karma, SoundHound, and Vicarious. Prior to starting Felicis Ventures, Aydin was a senior manager at Google, joining Google in 1999 as its first product manager to launch Google's first international sites. So he definitely knows his international business. Secondly, we've got Eileen Burbidge, a partner at Passion Capital, the preeminent early-stage venture capital fund based in London. Eileen has backed Monzo Bank, Digital Shadows, Focal Point Positioning, Prowler.io, Button-Up's Box, and many others. Burbidge started her career in Silicon Valley, working for some of the world's most prestigious tech companies, including Apple, Yahoo, and Sun Microsystems. And in 2004, she moved to London to become one of Skype's earliest employees. Sometimes called the Queen of British VC, Eileen is one of the UK's biggest tech personalities and one of London's most influential venture capitalists. Welcome to you both. Thanks very much for joining Europas Awards. Fantastic. Well, this is going to be a sort of a kind of a general opening score question, but we know that Europe's unicorns have been attracting the attention of US VCs for the last couple of years and longer. But I'd like to ask both of you. Let's start with you, Eileen. Do you think the pandemic and the switch to remote working and VC deals done over Zoom helped European startups raise internationally, or do you think the trend was going to happen anyway?
I think it's both. How do you like that? A panelist who sits on the fence. But I think it's actually both. I think the trend was happening anyway. And as you sort of clarified or sort of corrected, American investors, the ones that have been always looking further afield for really great value, innovation, and differentiation, have always looked at Europe, and especially the UK and London. And I think this was happening more and more. And we're also seeing a big influx of Asian investors, frankly, coming into London and the UK over, I would say, the last 5 years or so. And so you've seen, the UK attract all sorts of international investors for the last several years. And then with the pandemic and everyone moving to remote working, remote pitches, distributed decision-making, and collaborating across borders, frankly, yes, it accelerated that same trend that was already taking place.
Aydin, would you confirm that view, or did you think that the Americans were coming anyway?
Well, I think it's an interesting perspective, Mike, because when we invested in Aydin, I think it was 2013. So it's been 8 years. So maybe because I'm one of the Americans that actually lived and worked in Europe in many countries, I feel very much at home there. And I think that's why we've been kind of bullish on Europe for maybe close to a decade, rather. I will say, though, that our earlier investments, Aydin and Rovio, I've been in Helsinki in the middle of winter when there was 4 hours of sunlight, many times in Amsterdam, which I actually truly miss. It was really, really fun to spend time with the Aydin team. I will tell you that the COVID era made it a little bit easier. For instance, we made a great investment in UK, Supplant. Those founders were in YC, so we got a chance to meet them in person here. But I still have not been to their office in the UK, and yet I really believe in what they're doing. And then we made some more investments recently. I think we kind of started picking up the pace in 2021. And I do have to say, being able to do things over Zoom was really helpful. And we're used to being in different time zones. I always tell the founders that I'm a 24/7 concierge. I'm in the founder happiness business, high NPS for founders. So if anything, we all realize that as long as you're getting the main things done, obviously it's not as best as in person, but it was a great conduit and great facilitator of moving forward.
So it's obviously clearly a trend that is happening. But Eileen, from your perspective, as a London-based VC, definitely an early player in the European tech scene, also with a US background, did you feel, or have you started to feel that heat on the back of your neck of US VC, or have you heard any concerns about perhaps valuations, US money inflating European valuations, or do you think it's been overall a good trend?
Yeah, I know it would make for a spicier conversation if I said that, there were these bad things happening, or there is these things that we have to worry about, or I was feeling that sort of heat on the back of my neck. But honestly, I don't look at it that way. And I don't think, my fellow partners at Passion would view it that way, or much of the London ecosystem or that of the UK. What the increased, attention or the additional sources of capital for UK-based businesses and European businesses is a good thing. It's good for the ecosystem. It reflects really well on, it's a testament to how much is happening here. And ultimately, it'll drive, I think, as most market forces, most, maybe not all, but most, better outcomes. So it's all a good thing. And Aydin was right to point out, obviously, his early investments. And you kindly mentioned in the introduction that I moved to London to work for Skype. Let's not forget that in addition to Index Ventures, the early investors there in Skype were Bessemer and DFJ. And so there's always been, international venture capital available. Maybe, a couple of decades ago, that was because there was a gap, a much larger gap with homegrown or local capital here in the UK. Now you've clearly got, many more options, and that's really good. But I do think the competition is a good thing in terms of financing. You're seeing founder-friendlier terms. You're seeing, greater value add, or at least the opportunity to demonstrate that. And you're just seeing founders just getting to choose. They don't just have to choose the money. They can choose the type of money, the strategic interest, and the alignment that they think is going to benefit them the most.
Yeah, can I push back slightly on that and just give you one supplementary question on that, Eileen, about the types of money? You mentioned types of money. For instance, Tiger Global is considered sometimes almost closer to a hedge fund than a venture capital firm. Do you think that the hedge fund and the private equity style investing of the US coming to Europe is, do you think it's a good thing, or might have some problems somewhere?
Yeah, again, I probably don't see that as a trend. I think you're absolutely right. Of course, there are some very aggressive, investors with really deep pockets that can move really quickly, take really big positions. But, you mentioned Tiger as one example now. They're a great force. They've got a fantastic track record. And maybe a couple of years ago, we would have been talking about SoftBank, and maybe, I don't know, a decade or two ago, we'd have been talking about Tencent or something. My point being, there's always, a spectrum of different types of investors, and you're always going to have on the one extreme those that have really deep pockets, are keen to own a market or a sector and really move quickly and to dominate that position, and maybe even consolidate within that sector. There are others that are going to be super early stage, maybe take their time a bit, put in really patient capital, look for the sort of 10, 15-year type of IP development. And so we've always had that spectrum. And yes, it's a different cast of characters now, different names. But again, I think it's better for the ecosystem overall. And you'll always see natural selection at work, which is, the better investors will be around for the next wave, and the better companies and the better founders and entrepreneurs will be the ones who benefit.
And Aydin, on your side of the pond, as it were, are you excited about the fact that some of your fellow US investors have uncovered Europe as much as you have in the last 2 years? Or are you rubbing shoulders with, are you doing, is there competition for deals now that you might have been alone on?
Well, I kind of give them a hard time sometimes. I'm glad that they woke up. It's funny. I mean, when I started and I was talking about global investing, I remember VCs, including Mark Andreessen, mentioning that Silicon Valley is where it's at and they don't really need to go far beyond it. a lot has changed. I also talked about health. Now Andreessen has a health and bio fund. They also invest internationally. I'm glad more US VCs follow the example. I mean, we have to remember that I don't think this is as local of a business as people think. It's literally one global rush, a global hunt for the best companies. And I think when you change the discussion and say, okay, if it's the hunt for companies that can be truly global leaders and not just the European companies that are taking an American idea and coming up with the European version of it, companies are, VCs are realizing everywhere that you got to be wherever the best company is. And Europe has amazing IP, amazing talent. I agree with Eileen. I think intense competition is good for companies to have many more options. And capital is a commodity, so they're going to go look for the best investors. And we were just talking about the facilitation of Zoom. So it's not really that difficult to talk to a lot of investors very quickly and make up your mind. And you can also find out pretty quickly who's really going to hustle for you and make a difference. But I do have to compliment Europe. I just think sometimes, some of the great companies are underappreciated and underestimated. This happened with Aydin and Rovio, but recently with Supplant in the UK. I mean, if they succeed in what they're doing, they're going to have a sugar substitute that's none of the side effects or the bad things, half the calories, half the glycemic index. It can change the obesity epidemic in the world. And when we were so passionate about this, and when the company came around, we're like, oh my God, we have not seen any other company doing this. And we were so excited. And same thing is happening in other areas of Europe, especially in areas like Berlin with enterprise software, security, open code or fair code. So I do expect European companies to flex their muscles a little bit more. And competition is really fun. I do think that because of our diverse team and our background, we're more at home in Europe. And I think European founders are a little bit more sensitive to people that understand them, VCs they can trust, and VCs that get it and are really founder friendly.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there, you mentioned Supplant there, which is a very interesting company doing sugar replacement, and obviously a deep tech company from Cambridge. But obviously in the last sort of Eileen and I both know that in the last 10, 15 years, the story was very London heavy, but the London, Cambridge, Oxford heavy. But obviously, as the story's gone on, it's been about Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Stockholm, Lisbon, Paris, Barcelona, these rising hubs. Eileen, do you think the story of European cities outside of London has also taken off in their own right, as Barcelona for games, or France for hardware, for instance? Do you think that's happened as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And, Aydin's already talked about the Aydin story, and that's, demonstrated the strength of Amsterdam and how long there's been a hub and there's been a concentration of talent there. Similarly, because of my experience at Skype, I've always had an affinity towards the Baltics, and I think it's fantastic talent up in the Baltics, and you've seen that, of course, now since. And yes, as you say, all the cities you named, Lisbon, Eastern Europe, the Ukraine, it's as Aydin said, there's really no border as such, or restriction in terms of where talent's going to be and where the best companies are going to come from anymore. And so it behooves the investors to make sure that we're looking at all of them.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Eileen. I just would like to concur and add on the topic of transcending borders and breaking the rules. We have a great company actually in Spain that is working on IVF related technology that allows to make to make it easier to have kids. We have a company in the middle of nowhere in Germany that has the world's best drone tech that is used by the best armies and governments and all of that. And again, that's something very German specific. They have these very specialized industries and in the middle of nowhere with specialized schools. We just talked about Supplant and Cambridge, obviously, huge credits there. And in addition to what Eileen said about Amsterdam and Aydin, and by the way, we have another company with Dutch founders that is Colorado and Amsterdam. So we're seeing that a lot right now, like bi-coastal companies. They have a little bit of a foot in Europe, a little bit of a foot in the US, but also Helsinki and Finland. I mean, you have to give those guys credit, not just with Rovio, but Supercell, which we were not investors, but they literally I think, invented mobile apps. I mean, Rovio was the first truly international, truly multi-platform mobile app ever. So I think it's just a really great example to show where Europe can really lead and can make a difference. And we're looking for those companies, and there are those gems, even maybe in places like Bucharest and others also.
Yeah, well, you're right, absolutely, and it's been fascinating to see that take off over the last few years with all these new great companies emerging from these European hubs. But when you discuss Europe, you're never too far away from the word B for Brexit, and I'd be interested to know by both of you whether or not that's going to inform startup founder strategies or investor strategies over the next few years. Will it be the case that UK startups start looking to the US more than they used to in Europe? I know Monzo, for instance, has slightly changed tack and focused more on the US in the last year or so. Other companies, UK companies, thinking, well, maybe it's harder to scale in the EU, so maybe we should shift gears to Europe, to the US earlier than they might otherwise have done. I'd be interested in your perspective, both of you, on that Brexit that Brexit effect, as it were.
Yeah, so I think I just have to clarify probably for Monzo, US was always part of their plan, even before Brexit or even before they, assumed that was going to be a reality. In that, the original founding team thought the US market was far more interesting for them, and because of the cultural alignment with what was working with customers organically here in the UK, rather than Europe. Having said that, to your question, I do think there's going to be a Brexit impact, but it might be a bit early to say, or too early to tell. I think everything has been taking longer than any of us would have liked here in the UK for, us to sort of see the ramifications of Brexit. And I think the same is going to hold true for this ecosystem. I think what will be most, impactful, or the biggest variable, is going to be that of where talent is. I think if it's going to be harder for founders to, hire here in the UK or to recruit people to move to the UK, then also over time, those founders are going to, decide to have their sort of HQ somewhere else. Having said that, at the same time, COVID probably neutralized that a bit because we did have this whole trend towards remote working. And now, I don't know if there's a difference about whether or not a developer is, in the same office as a founder or not. And so, again, I think it's going to take a while and we're going to have to wait and see. But I don't think there are many businesses that I know of that are rethinking their international expansion plans, which I think is what you were getting to, Mike, because of Brexit. Not yet, anyway.
Right. Aydin, quickly, can I have a quick answer from you about why you think, whether or not you think Brexit will have any effect at all?
I don't think it really had an effect on us, to be honest with you. But I do remember right when Aydin was going public, the people that were most vocal about it were the European VCs that were based in London. And they just did not, they were not very happy about the complexity and having to deal with that and potentially relocating. But the last thing that I want to add is, look, for me, and I think Eileen concurred on this point too, we're looking for companies that are transcending borders. It's not just about Brexit or even all of Europe. We want to find the founders that literally want to have a product for the whole world and have a global, way of thinking. And I think where the US VCs can really help for some of those companies, US is a very important market or one of the biggest, or they might need something really important or strategic or different way of thinking. So we always love to collaborate with our European friends, especially Eileen and Passion Capital and others like Index. We have huge respect for them and work with them very closely. But we also, I think, can bring that kind of European closeness to the founders and, an appreciation for who they are without necessarily being based in Europe, but also bring them great benefits, like in some cases, like getting them a key advisor from a company that is US based or from a very important strategic partner or business development and sales. And for founders, I think it really comes down to hey, can you really help me? Can you hustle for me? Can you have an impact? And can I trust you? And so what we are finding is that obviously it would have been best if we're very close to them and where they are, but being a couple time zones away, maybe 10, has not been as much of a factor as we have seen. So we want European founders to continue innovating, and we'll be there to hopefully partner with them along with Eileen and the rest of our friends.
Well, that Aydin, you make a very good point there, and I think I've spoken to lots of startup founders myself and found that the switch to remote working has worked. Obviously, there have been some problems in terms of perhaps a bit of burnout sometimes as well. The remote thing definitely sort of starting to be almost baked in actually long term. But I'd like this sort of combination of remote working, remote deal making amongst investors now with founders internationally across Europe and between the US and Europe. Eileen, first of all, and to wrap up, let's talk about the long-term trends. Where do you see these baked-in behaviours now? Are you excited to get back to real-world meetings eventually, or do you think there's going to be more of a hybrid approach amongst investors? And how do you see that playing out with the incursion, or shall we say collaboration perhaps with US investors coming to Europe as well?
Yeah, no, so I wish I always had a crystal ball, Mike. You always ask me these hard questions. I don't know what to predict. I think what's going to happen is hybrid. Again, that's me sitting on the fence. But it's also going to be founder-led, founder-driven, right? Aydin and I think he had a great sort of saying where he's the concierge and he's there for founder happiness. Those are our clients, really. And if founders want to start meeting in person, if they're going to start wanting to sort of say, listen, I want to get a feel for what the vibe is going to be like. I want to know what a brainstorm session is if we're in the same room together. And they're going to be sort of comparing investors that way. Clearly, investors are going to need to respond. If the founders are saying, no, I want to remote work and I'm this week in Bali and I'm next week going to be in Indonesia and I'm this next week going to be in Beijing, so let's just do a call. We'll just do calls. I think that, we're going to see which way they find sort of more productive and constructive for them. Personally, I've gotten really comfortable with remote working and with Zoom, and my natural introvert has been celebrating for the last year or so. So I'll force myself back into a hybrid role. But I also do remember how much easier it is, to brainstorm, to share not necessarily good news, to sort of break something to somebody in sort of, if you've got to tee up some bad news or some difficult feedback, much easier face to face. And so I do think that kind of interaction is important. So I don't think it's going to go away. And I do think we'll be at least hybrid, if not going back to the way it used to be.
And Aydin, what's your view about that, the new trend of working for investors and whether or not you think that's baked in now, especially for US investors investing in Europe?
Yeah, I think the hybrid approach will likely stay once investors have gotten the taste of they can do this from literally anywhere. Like I remember signing deals and closing things even when I was in the Caribbean for a week. All of a sudden you feel that, you taste that, there's no going back. I think it also completely changes scalability, right? You can literally talk to a company in Berlin and a couple hours later a company in London. Even if you could fly and be there in person, it would be physically impossible. So I think it's just going to stay, but there are, I think, important moments. I do remember with the Berlin founder, us talking about his favorite is a local burger joint, and obviously we need to have some German beer. And I also would love to visit Supplant in Cambridge and maybe get a pint with them at the local pub. And as long as we at least have some of those experiences, but deliver the goods, it'll be great. But I would say that the hybrid approach is here to stay.
Well, that's fascinating and it's very interesting to see that. Certainly, I think we could probably all concur that. Not only have founders gone international and remote working, investors have as well. And that applies especially to US investors investing in Europe. Well, that's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you both for joining the Europas Awards. Thank you, Aydin Senkut, founder and managing partner of Felicis Ventures, and Eileen Burbidge, co-founder and partner at Passion Capital. And from me, Mike Butcher, from Europas, thanks very much for joining.